All right, hello, welcome back, everybody. PayPal and Patreon are down below if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. And if you want to get a hold of the graphs used in this video, then you can access them and all kinds of other graphs in the Google Drive folder that is linked in the description below as well. Any support also helps with the maintenance of that database. Anyways, it's time to go through the monthly OPEC oil production numbers. And OPEC has begun raising production, kind of. They said they were going to, even said they were going to raise it by larger amounts than expected. However, I did have that initial sinking suspicion that the larger than expected announcement was a sort of cover over, an excuse for the fact that the UAE had already jumped up to about 3.3 or 3.2 million barrels per day, as the UAE, along with many other members, Iraq, Nigeria, formerly Angola, who has now left, along with others, was kind of done following the whole rule set anyways. The whole OPEC unity and production cuts had turned into essentially a facade. You can see a breakdown on the slow disintegration of OPEC unity and otherwise in a linked video in the corner. But since almost no one was actually following the production cuts anyways, no one's really raising their production because they already were not keeping their production down like they were supposed to. Going through the numbers themselves, starting with the largest producer in the group, obviously Saudi Arabia, had otherwise been holding a 10 million barrel per day plateau for a while, and one with their current remaining reserve set, their actual remaining numbers, not the eternally unchanging 262 billion, never going up or down remaining barrels that they've claimed to have for the past 4 decades, or 3 decades rather, however long it's been, would put them crossing over the halfway threshold and thus unable to maintain that plateau in the early 2030s, so upcoming very soon. And thusly, for the last number of years, inside and outside of production cuts, they have liked maintaining their plateau back down at 9 million to sort of, I'd assume, gradually get the market psychologically primed or used to them being lower than 10. And although the production cuts are officially over for the group, Saudi Arabia did declare at the start that they will continue keeping their own production down indefinitely. We're obviously, we'll have to wait and see if they do hold to that. But anyways, for the last 2 or 3 years, they've been holding down at around 9, sometimes down to 8.9. This time they came in just above 9 at 9.01 million barrels per day of production. Algeria was one of the only two other members actually cutting their production, actually following the orders, and they had peaked back at 1.4 a while ago, climbed capability wise down close to 1, and because of some enhanced recovery stuff and a few small new fields, once they finally just recently started doing oil and gas exploration again, they were able to hold off their capability from declining further and have kept it still around 1 or a bit above 1. But they've kept their production in line with the production cuts down closer to 900,000. Although now that the cuts are over, they've begun climbing back up by a small marginal amount, from around 908 back up to now 912,000 barrels per day. Next door, Libya, after all the ups and downs of the civil war, was finally restoring its production decently, getting back up from 1 up to 1.1, then to 1.2, and finally bringing some stuff back online in the last year or so that had been offline since 2011, and bringing them back up to about 1.4. They're a little bit further down from that at the moment. Probably something is down for maintenance somewhere, as they came in at 1.37. Nigeria once held a plateau up around 2 million, and theoretically still could for a decade or two. However, over the course of the 2010s, they tumbled all the way down towards 1.4, 1.3 because of a mixture of terrorist attacks on their infrastructure, oil pipeline theft and diversion networks, and also just internal financial corruption, failure to reinvest money into maintaining and furthering the oil and gas infrastructure. They have started correcting and repairing some stuff recently over the last year, and that saw them finally able to bring themselves from 1.3 back up to 1.5, which OPEC told them not to do, to instead stay down at 1.3, and Nigeria said no and brought themselves back up to 1.5 anyways. So they were one of the final nails in the coffin of the facade. Yet another country jumping onto the list of publicly disobeying and just not even going along with the production cuts anymore. This time they came in at 1.49 million barrels per day. Back over in the Persian Gulf, the UAE, as mentioned, is up at 3.2. Normally they had been maintaining a 3 million barrel per day plateau. They want to go up to a 4 million barrel per day one, as their own oil consumption, their domestic oil demand levels are up to 1.2 million barrels per day now, as you can see from some of these other graphs. So their export margin was getting a bit thinner, not actually thin, just getting thinner than it used to be. Kuwait, the one other member who was actually obeying, or still is actually, the production cut rules or what they were supposed to be at, normally held a 3 million barrel per day plateau. They were asked under the cuts to drop down to 2.6, which they did. And then later they were asked to drop further down to 2.4, likely to make up some margin for other members' disobedience. And they have not even started increasing yet. They're still down at 2.41 million barrels per day. Iraq has been fluctuating up between 4 and 4.5. They're supposed to be, or while the cuts were in place, they were supposed to be down to 3.8, but they would go up towards 4.5, then act like they were going to follow the rules and start lowering themselves down towards 4, but then abruptly jump back up to 4.5. And they had been in the process of doing another one of their supposed production lowerings just before the cuts ended. So they came in at 4. Iran once held a 6 million barrel per day plateau, was never able to restore that after the revolution, so they held a 4 million barrel per day plateau. And during the era of sanctions, they were unable to sell oil, so had to cut their production down to just under 2 million, as that's their domestic consumption level. However, when the sanctions started getting removed and they were allowed to export again, they obviously started bringing their production back up. However, they can't get it back to 4 million because their fields are so matured and decayed in terms of their pressure gradients that to maintain decent enough output levels, they require a lot of natural gas reinjection, which they've also been having supply issues with. So, on top of having supply issues with the natural gas, because some portion of their natural gas came accompanying the oil production, they also now are having internal domestic supply issues for heating and power because they're having to use so much of a shrinking margin of natural gas to reinject into their oil fields so that they can pump out enough oil to sell to make money. So the threshold they were able to recover up to seems to have been about 3.3. This time they're coming in at 3.31 million barrels per day. And Venezuela, once at a 3 million barrel per day plateau, with the extent of the Orinoco Belt, they could hold that for this entire century. However, when the country collapsed in the later 2010s, it took its oil production down with it, all the way down to 400,000. However, with the help of Chevron over the last number of years, they've been able to gradually recover back up over 1 million. However, they're potentially stopping off here as they've now been at 1.04 or 1.05 for the last couple months, as Chevron was barred or banned by the current US regime from helping Venezuela any further. So, fair chance this is where Venezuela's recovery is going to stop and potentially see them abruptly plummet again. And then two smaller members, Gabon and the Congo, the smaller of the two Congos, the more stable one. Gabon had declined down to around 180, but then a moderate new field offshore boosted them back up to 220 or 230. This time they're coming in at 222,000 barrels per day. And the smaller of the two Congos has declined down to, but has now started hanging out around or fluctuating around the mid 200s, this time coming in back up at 270,000 barrels per day. All right, that's it for this one. So thank you everybody for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. PayPal and Patreon, YouTube membership button, everything's down there if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can, which also helps maintain all the graphs and database stuff that's in that Google Drive link, all of which is perpetually free to access. There's links to my photography Instagram, my Blue Sky, one in the top and comment to my cat's YouTube channel. May God bless and protect all of you, and I will see you all around next time.